Morning. It's Stoll. We will talk about the hot topic for um IRC, which the only one active right now is CDFA, Continuous Descent Final Approach. Like Joel said in his Slack message there, if you need it logged off, go ahead and do the CBT within the next week or two and send it to either me or Joel, and we'll log you off with the 1522. So CDFA, big picture. Air Force has kind of been slow to adopt the technique. A lot of MWSs apparently don't do it much. I think C5s, we do it fairly well, or at least we talk about it. I don't know that a lot of us actually end up flying it. But this will be a good refresher, kind of a good reminder to go in, read chapter 18 of the 217, which talks about this, and maybe actually start applying it a little more in the jet. So CDFA, yeah, reduces our chances of CFIT. Also helps us fly a nice stable approach to meet the stabilized approach criteria for both 1,000 and for 500 feet. If I can figure out how to get this to move. Next slide. Sweet. So there's two studies we'll look at from Boeing that kind of show some data trending the direction we don't want it. And then we'll look at what is CDFA, the pros, cons, and then how to fly one. So first Boeing study is from 1998 to 2007. It looks at fatal accidents and onboard fatalities by each phase of flight. These studies are for only commercial jets heavier than 60,000 pounds, so this does not include little Cessnas or even little business jets. The numbers we're concerned about is the fatal accidents line there. So you can see that final approach consists for 3% of your total flight time, and the landing phase consists of 1%. So in that 4% total, it accounts 33% of the fatal accidents account in that final approach and landing phase. So pretty high. And then moving on to the study after that, same study, but from 2008 to 2017, you can see still 4% of the total flight time is in that final approach and landing phase. Yet now we've increased to 49% of fatal accidents occur in that phase. So numbers are trending in the direction we don't want. So the FAA has kind of highlighted it. ICAO has now mandated it. And Air Force is trying to follow suit. So the Flight Safety Foundation, which is just it's a nonprofit independent foundation. They did a study and found that 75% of the fatal accidents occurred on non-precision approaches. And obviously the most hazardous of those being ones with multiple step-down fixes and shallow descent paths from your FAF to your VDP. So that kind of makes sense, right? You have a shallow descent rate and you're doing a dive and drive technique, you're going to get far below the desired glide path that the approach kind of drives you to. So this is directly from the 217. Again, chapter 18, I highly recommend after this, you just go review it. The foot stomp here is that it's the preferred method. So it's not mandated for Air Force. However, it's definitely preferred. And it allows us to fly a non-precision approach as a constant descent. So it can start an altitude at or above the FAF and then ends at an altitude about 50 feet above the landing threshold. So this is kind of a dumb example, but this is just a single step down fix approach here. You can see the MDA from the FAF to the MDA and then a 2-degree descent angle down to the runway. So a CDFA is highlighted in red, which would be a constant descent down instead of doing the dive down to the MDA and then driving in to your VDP. So ICAO Doc 8168, it's something I've never looked at until this became the hot topic. It's the ICAO's flying manual regulation. So it highlights, it can either be calculated by onboard equipment, which would be great if we could do. Unfortunately, the C5, the FMS, as we all know, with VNAV does not allow us to just quick put in the data, and it won't pop out, the number we want or a vertical glide slope. So we always do the second method there, manual calculations for required rate of descent. That second paragraph there just says that doing it that way, we're considered a two-dimensional operation. So it also highlights that doing this method, we should never be flying in level flight at the MDA, which makes sense. We should be having that constant descent down to our MDA altitude, and then either continuing to land with the required visual references in sight, which from the 217, again, is the runway environment, or executing a missed approach if we don't have the runway environment in sight. So not leveling off and driving in. That brings up the point that you can't drive on a constant descent down to your MDA and then execute the missed approach, right? Because we have that reaction time, both human reaction plus the jet, before we establish a positive rate of climb. So that's where a derived decision altitude comes in. So it's an altitude slightly above the MDA, kind of industry standard is 50 feet. So that by the time we initiate, you still have that lag before the jet actually spools up and begins the climb, so that we don't penetrate below the MDA. So at the DDA, the derived decision altitude, again, that's 50 feet usually above the published MDA, you have the options of either continuing, if you have the runway environment in sight, or going missed, or landing. So from the 217 again, it says MAGCOMs will establish a acceptable method for calculating DDA. I was hunting around this morning. I couldn't find any guidance where it talks about a DDA. If somebody knows of one, feel free to chime in. I'm still on the hunt, and I'll post a question on the AFSA website if no one has anything. So FAA is it's not mandatory for the FAA. However, it's a standard operating procedure, so it's highly desired. They published an advisory circular. If you search this on Google, you can read the whole thing. It has a lot of good information in it. But then there's the European Union, which is mandating CDFAs. So this is directly from that EU Ops 1.43. So it says all non-precision approaches shall be flown using CDFA unless otherwise approved by the authority. So the reason we can kind of get out of that says military state aircraft are exempt from this requirement. However, if we do the dive and drive technique in the EU, we have to increase our RVR minimums by 400 meters for category C and D. That's a little known fact there, but is mandatory. However, we can get out of it. But if we do want to get out of it and do our old technique, we need to increase our minimums for RVR. Pros and cons, pretty self-explanatory. Pros, obviously you have a single pitch and power setting. You have that constant descent. You're not doing multiple level offs. And then noise abatement, fuel conservation. We don't care so much about noise abatement, but fuel conservation, if we're running low on fuel, even in our the 2C5 Fall 3 directs that a constant descent approach is preferred for fuel conservation. So, and then cons, sorry. Yeah, obviously you can, if you miss a level off fix when you're doing the dive and drive, you can end up going into terrain, right? So that's one of the big factors for that study was CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. More pros. I'll let you read them there. Big picture is it just allows us to fly a nice stable approach, increases our situational awareness, and reduces the pilot workload when you're in that critical phase of flight. So how to fly CDFA? We don't have the capability to do it automatically. I think C-17s do, and a lot of the commercial guys do, where they can plug in the desired altitude and then 50 feet above the threshold. And the jet will automatically calculate a required descent and give them vertical guidance. So we end up always doing the manual method. So we have the published vertical descent angle on the approach plate, which is usually 3 degrees. And then we can convert that to a required rate of descent. So we usually use the manually the letter B there. So we're kind of the last resort based on the technology we have. So look at a quick example. Here's an example approach. You can see 3.2 degrees is the VDA there. Then if you go into the back of the approach book or in the legend under Aero app, you can use your ground speed and that descent angle, and it'll give you a rate of climb in feet per minute. And using that rate of climb, you can kind of back yourself up. So say you want to cross the runway threshold at 50 feet and you know what your required descent angle or your required descent rate is. You can kind of back that up and have gates to make sure you're meeting that to see if you need to change your rate of descent during the approach. Ideally, if you calculate it perfectly and fly it perfectly, you won't have to change anything throughout the entire approach. Here are the references that are shown in here. Again, I'd highly recommend going through, reading chapter 18 of the 217. I know a lot of us probably haven't looked too much at the new 217 that was released, so this is a good chance to at least read chapter 18. If you want, like I said, Google that advisory circular, the 120-108. Gives you good information. It has a lot of good examples in there for Jeppesen approaches. They were saying that a lot of countries now are starting to publish CDFA approaches. So on the top of the approach plate, it'll say CDFA. I searched around, tried to find some current examples. I couldn't find any. If anyone knows of any, that would be awesome. Please send them to me. And that's all I've got. Like I said, if you would like IRC logged off, please do the IRC CBT within the next week or 2 weeks and send it to me or to Joel, and we'll submit a 1522 for you. And open for discussion if anyone has anything.
Yeah, I've got a quick question as far as like the way we fly it. Is it best just like you said, use the manual pitch wheel to put in the VVI down that we calculate and just do that, or is there a better way via VNav, or what is the usual best way?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I've personally never seen anyone really use the VNav. I'd say the C5 community as a whole kind of discourages it just because how unreliable it is. Pitch wheel down or just manually flying it. If you're hand flying the jet, yeah, those are the two best options for you.
Yeah, so the 2C503 restricts you from utilizing VNav, right, in the approach phase, which I would define as like the final approach fix. Well, yeah, any portion of the approach, I guess. I need to look at the verbiage, but certainly from the final approach fix down to minimums, we can't have VNav. Joe Stevenson brought up in the chat that you can program the box to calculate the VNav descent, and it should give you the little glide slope indicator, so you could use that as a reference. But yeah, so vert speed is probably going to be 99% of people's techniques to be able to do that. The climb dive marker, or sorry, the FPA line, right? if you put it at the final approach fix, right? Or at the final approach fix, you start your descent and you put it right on whatever the FPA is that's been calculated. That should also keep you right on speed. One of the things that I'm sure Fez can talk to you about it, or Colonel Trumbull can talk about it from recent IP upgrades where they flew a PAR approach. One of the most important parts about trying to calculate a CFDA is being on speed at the final approach fix, right? Because if I hit the final approach fix and I'm 30 knots fast, then I'm going to have to kind of adjust my my vert speed down as I start my descent, right? So if I'm doing 170 when I hit the final approach fix and I'm just now getting my flaps to landing and I'm slowing, my vert speed's going to change, right? Because my ground speed's changing. So if you're gonna fly a non-precision approach, utilizing the CDF or CFDA, which I would highly, highly, highly recommend, you want to make sure that you're on your approach speed when you start your descent. And same thing, like if you're flying a PAR or an ASR, same thing. Like it's going to be really hard to maintain that CFDA as your ground speed's changing, which is going to require your vert speed to change.
And Joel, and with one more tip in there, I see a lot of people trying to do this, and I'm guilty as well. I calculate, I need a 600 VSI down or whatever it may be. If you hit your final approach fix and you go, okay, pass final approach fix, 600 VSI down, scroll your vert speed wheel down 600 VSI down. By the time the jet starts to actually descend, you're already a good half mile, if not more, inside. And so compound that with going 30 knots above approach speed, you're instantly going to need 1,000 VSI just to get back on that glide slope. And so like the concept only works if you actually execute it the way that you do the math. And very seldomly do we fly the airplane like that. So, you know, 1 or 2 potatoes before the final approach fix, scroll the vert speed wheel down, and the jet won't actually descend until you're past the final approach fix anyways, but you'll have a significantly less delay.
Bateman here. I also have some story time about VNAV guidance. It was not that long ago over at Dover, we had an FTU instructor who was messing around with VNAV. And the guidance then was very similar to it is today in terms of not using it for the final approach. He was legal in some regards. So it was VMC, the vertical navigation guidance was kind of just being put in the box on a couple of VFR patterns to kind of mess around with it and see how it works. But unfortunately, the individual got so far behind the jet and so heads down on the approach because they were messing around with the VNAV so much that they landed without clearance. So that created huge ripples through the tower. Eventually, the individual, I think, got a Q3/1 for it. So I guess when I caution people about using VNAV during the final approach phase is like, I think this is probably something better to play around with in the sim at this point. And I think there are probably easier tools like using the flight path angle, pig on the dance floor, whatever you want to call it, where you can get similar effects. Of course, like in the future, I would love to be able to have VNAV. And unfortunately, that's not, I think, part of the Lockheed roadmap, at least in the short term. But it definitely is a weak spot. I know we had a really good CT a couple weeks ago from Lighter about VNAV, but I just want to throw out a warning of caution that VNAV inside the final approach fix, even if it is VMC, if you're not comfortable with it, might set you up to fail.
Can we go back to Adam's statement about leading the descent at the FAF? Is there a good like do we start wheeling it down like 0.1 or 0.2 miles from the FAF, because that way we're not descending below the FAF, or is there a I don't want to say good technique because that sounds really stupid, but is there a common ground for when we should start wheeling it down in distance times, or is there like a gate to give us a heads up?
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a gate that I use. I would say when it's like 1 or 2 potatoes, that's kind of what I would think. Like maybe 3 to 4 seconds. Like it's not much because what you said is 100% right. You don't want to be descending. I never want to be, and I want to just put that out there. Like I'm not encouraging you to vert speed yourself down early and then go through the FAF below your final approach fix altitude. Definitely not the case. I'm just trying to recognize that the jet doesn't respond as fast as we put control inputs into it. And so I'm trying to lead the control input to get it to actually do what I want when I want him to do it. I think it's more of a recognition thing that you're never going to be able to get it to do that. You're never going to be at the final approach fix descending at 600 VSI. The only way to get the jet actually descending at 600 VSI at final approach fix is to probably start your descent 50 to 100 feet high and 0.1 miles out so that you're established in that descent when you cross it. And that's definitely not a technique that I'm trying to offer up. I just want people to be aware that the math in this theoretical world doesn't necessarily apply perfectly to the actual world that we operate the jet in. But you'll see me typically, I don't know, 5 seconds before the final approach fix, just go ahead and hit the vert speed wheel down. By the time that the jet actually starts to descend, I'm generally less inside my final approach fix than if I had waited that 5 seconds to recognize passage and then push the vert speed wheel down.
Has there been any discussion on getting LNAV, VNAV guidance again for RNAV approaches? Because I know I heard back in the old days when the C5 first had or was given permission for RNAV approaches, we were doing down the VNAV mins, but just curious if there's been any work on trying to get that back.
This is Bateman here. To my knowledge, no. And with the software updates that we're seeing in 3.9 light, or 3.9, 4.1 light, and 4.1 heavy, I mean, even after flying the software, the VNAV performance was pretty terrifying. I mean, the auto throttle response getting 20, 30, 40 knots below target speeds, and it wasn't really holding the vertical profile at all. Like really over and undershooting it. So I think we do have kind of a ways to go until we'll start to see any VNAV performance that that works for us.
Gotcha. For the group, if you guys want to give yourself a challenge, look at when you get a chance, look at Rhoda's approach plate for the TACAN 2.8 and just kind of calculate, you know, a VDP, etc., or a descent rate. As you'll see on that approach plate, there's no like flight path angle or anything like that it gives you. So you kind of have to do it all yourself. And so it's a good little homework problem just to kind of get in the books on that.
I think going back to the DDA discussion, an important distinction between a precision approach and a non-precision approach. Your MDA is the bare minimum of what you're allowed to descend below, whereas on a precision approach, they actually it is within the obstacle criteria. I'm not going to say it's TERPS because I know Nick Martini hates that term as a verb, but you're protected from obstacles based on a calculation of dipping below your decision altitude to be able to execute the missed approach. So that's why that DDA is there. That's important as a point to start your missed approach from, because you're not considered safe from obstacles if you were to descend below the MDA without the runway in sight. So that's why that DDA is there, is because of how the approach is designed. And then if nobody else has anything, this is from a CT I taught last summer, but I have the Asiana crash video genned up, which is a really good visual representation of why calculating a CFDA is important and why doing this, even on a clear VFR day, could have helped save some lives. So it's like 3.5 minutes. So I feel like it's probably worth our time just to watch and refresh real fast. So, and then obviously we can continue to discuss after.
In this still image, the autopilot is on. The airplane has been vectored to a 14-mile-long final approach, and through a sequence of speed and configuration changes, the flight had diverged well above the desired glide path and was descending too slowly. As the animation begins, the landing gear was extended, and the pilot monitoring remarks that they were a little high. The pilot flying said he would descend more and selected 1,500 feet per minute descent rate in the autopilot. As you can see in the profile view, this did begin to bring the airplane back toward the desired glide path. However, about 6 miles from the runway, the selected descent rate was set back to 1,000 feet per minute. The airplane was still well above the desired glide path. The selected altitude was changed to 3,000 feet to prepare the autopilot in case a go-around was needed. The airplane passed the final mile point near the final approach phase, about 400 feet higher than desired. Crew began slowing the airplane. The pilot flying called for flaps 30. The pilot monitoring noted they were still a little too fast for flaps 30. The pilot flying switched the autopilot to flight level change mode, which did not help with the descent and resulted in the airplane initiating a climb to the 3,000 foot altitude that was previously set. To prevent the climb, the pilot disconnected the autopilot and reversed the thrust levers to idle. This resulted in the auto throttle transitioning to hold mode. In hold mode, the auto throttle does not control airspeed. Descent rate increased to about 1,500 feet per minute, and the observer pilot noted sink rate. About 1.4 miles from the runway, the airplane descended into the desired glide path and slowed to the target approach speed. Pitch attitude steadily increased as the pilot pulled back on the column in an effort to maintain the glide path. The airplane was well below glide path, and airspeed was 1 knots below the desired approach speed, rapidly dropping. 11 seconds before impact, an audible alert sounded because the airspeed was too low. 4 seconds later, the pilot monitoring advanced the thrust levers, followed by stationary traffic control. The pilot rolled to the roof. These actions were too late, and the main gear and the underside of the aft fuselage struck the seawall.
So yeah, so you can see how on a non-precision approach, not being at final approach fix on speed, ready to roll, it's really difficult to figure out what your descent angle is, what your what that CFDA even is, because your speed's all over the place. Obviously, they were high, so the setup to their approach just was not good. My understanding, some of the background on this story was they didn't catch that the ILS was out that day, so they're just expecting to fly the ILS. It's kind of a last-minute switch over to flying the localizer, but weather was not a contributing factor in that approach at all, in the sense that you know, it was a normal non-precision approach that they just failed to execute.
So if you ever find yourself in Sacramento for some reason, the fire chief there was the fire chief at San Francisco the day that happened. I think when we diverted there, we got a chance. Me and D-Bake got a chance to talk to him about it. It was pretty eye-opening.
If you've ever flown a local or probably a mission with me, I've probably questioned when you brief your stabilized criteria where you're getting your vertical speed from, right? And I've probably made you calculate what your actual VBI would need to be, precision, non-precision approach, all that sort of stuff. For me, that's, I think, a huge SA builder for flying an approach, because if I'm on an approach and I look down and I see that my VBI is at 800 or 900 down, I know that that's too fast, depending on what the glide slope angle is, right? I know that's too fast of a descent rate for what I'm doing. So I'm either high, right, trying to get back onto a normal glide path, or I'm going to end up doing a dive and driving. I'm going to get down really early. And like Adam talked about in the presentation, the downside to dive and drive is that instead of having a stable power setting, right, you're going to have multiple power pushes and pulls, right? So your power pulling to start your descent faster than what you would expect, right, to get down, right? Then you're going to push your power up as you level off at the MDA. And then as you need to start your descent again, you're also going to have to pull your power again. And now you're actually trying to find that exact power for your final descent, right? Versus where if you at the final approach fix, you started a normal descent, you wouldn't have to touch your power at all. So calculating what your actual VDP or actually what your actual VSI is going to be based on gross weight, right? Remembering that our gross weight can shift 300,000 pounds in flight, right? So you could be landing anywhere from like a 800,000 pound airplane where your VSI could be somewhere close to, 750, 800 down to, 430,000 pound airplane that your vert speed on a precision approach even is going to be 600 down.
It's also worth noting that if we're calculating a CFTP, whatever it is, and you do come up with like an 800 or 900 VBI, which is actually possible with some approaches. There are a few out there, but it is possible. Realize that we're calculating that to have a 3-degree glide slope in that last 3 miles as well. So there are still going to be pitch and power changes, but they shouldn't be super aggressive like they are if you do a dive and drive. And that's the whole idea, is to stabilize the approach as much as you can, not to set like a perfect pitch and power setting that's going to be maintained all the way throughout, all the way until your flare and landing.
Do you guys want to discuss VDPs at all?
Sure, Nick, lead away.
I don't know. I was hoping for someone smart to do it. Just because I remember calculating them all the time, and I still teach that, but I also know they said at one point to not do that. But I do it as an SA tool, saying if we're going to get down past this point, like our option is a long landing, which we generally don't want. but I just wanted to hear more AAS level discussion about it.
How about this? Instead of kind of shooting from the hip, since it's not necessarily something that we all. Yeah, Jeff just put it in there, right? Guess where's a hat? Let's we'll put it as a future CT topic. And by future, I mean who wants to volunteer to teach either Friday or Monday. And we can have a real in-depth discussion, kind of like part 2 to this, if that seems like people are interested in it.
Yeah, I'd just like to know if that's something I should still be teaching or not.
Yeah, so one of the big pushes that comes with CFDA is the push to publish VDPs. They are still, as they build approaches and update approaches and things like that, there is a push to do away with approaches where you have to calculate it on your own. But that's obviously not universal. Yeah, I think VDPs are still important. But I think we could do a whole probably CT discussion on VDPs.
Sweet. And do we have, I know there was a chat about collecting all these presentations that are made. Do we have Ben's VNav presentation anywhere? I'd like to look at it. I guess I could just text him. But
Yeah, Keenan and Kim are working on compiling it all, and it should all end up on the 20-second SharePoint, which I know you don't have access to. So,
I can do SharePoint. I just don't have shared drive.
or sorry, the shared drive I think is where they were going to put
Okay.
them. So,
Womp.
but we can get it to you. Yeah, and the virtual ones, Jeff's he's recording all these discussions, so they're going on YouTube. Sweet. Anything else? Comments, questions? I'm open to open up the floor to further discussion about training or questions that people have had. I know it's been a couple weeks since we've kind of had the open forum about missions and things like that, or how do I get on a local, or questions that are lingering about that stuff.